As the doom of the Western Empire was pending, hordes of barbarians swept with the sword into northern Italy. The Visigoths, Huns, the Vandals all sunk their teeth into the dying predator, sacking Rome itself in 410 and again in 455 AD. Terrorized by the invasions, some of Rome's remaining noble families gathered what wealth and property they could carry with them and fled north. They found a place of refuge from the carnage they themselves had created within the armpit of Italy upon a swampy lagoon. Although they fled in desperation, leaving much behind, their ruling class identities were not sacrificed in the journey.
God, who is our help and protection, has saved us in order that we may dwell upon these watery marshes. This Venice, which we have raised in the lagoons, is a mighty habitation for us. No power of emperor or prince can reach us save by the sea alone, and of them we have no fear.
Thus, Venice became the place of refuge of the fleeing nobility, but had not its capital, until Angelo of the rolling Badour family placed the canals, the bridges, and a ducal palace upon the sewer. During this time, Byzantium still assumed it was a power, but as the centuries went on, the oligarchy, which ran the empire through the control of money and the organization of money, leaned more and more on Venice as their center of imperial activity.
When in 1000 the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis, that was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066 the Normans took over England and the Saxons got defeated, and then eventually Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now naturally Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
Centuries had passed from the day the ruling families left Rome, and the Venetians rapidly asserted a maritime dominance that no one could or would dare to challenge. Recognizing her might, the Istrians begged Venice for protection from Slavic pirates. This protection was granted gracefully, at the price of 100 jars of wine per year. Though her mother, Byzantium, interfered with her desire of controlling a global financial maritime empire, as Byzantium still controlled the trade routes of the East, Venice overcame these circumstances and managed to secure trading privileges over Byzantium's territories. They accomplished this by making the emperor fearful of foreign attack, an attack which Venice herself was well equipped to foment. The 20 to 30 rolling Venetian families prided themselves on being descendants of the imperial Rome of Caesar, but whether they were really related by flesh or not, they were descendants of Rome's imperial ideology, for this oligarchy was clearly committed to the ancient model that created Rome, and were determined to ensure that Venice would embody empire.
Be thou unique in the isolation of thy sight. None shall resemble thee. In thy freedom from pope and emperor, none shall rival thee. The city thou buildest on the ooze of the lagoon shall outlast the rock-built cities of the crag and the broad-laid cities of the plain. Out of thine incessant combat with the sea shall come thy strength. Thy soul shall delight in beauty, and beautiful shall be thy handiwork.
Of course, anything that could come from the handiwork of Venice will be anything but beautiful. Her handiwork was one of dumping many into wars, while making them believe that the Venetians were really their ally, and that they shared common interest. Like its descendants in the British Empire of today, Venice had no permanent allies, only permanent interests. To gain her interests, emperors and kings were to play her game, and if they refused or retaliated, they would simply meet their doom. Byzantium was one significant force that chose not to play her game. This was troublesome, for without Constantinople she would lose access to the Black Sea and all the treasures that lay in Asia and the Middle East. Ultimately, Constantinople did fall to the Venetians, not by her own hand, but by the hand she manipulated.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghost Seer, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weakness is, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, they have all of their desires sated, they get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
"15 years after Pope Gregory VII undertook major reforms, establishing ultramontane rule over all kingdoms of Europe, Pope Urban II delivered an infamous sermon at the Council of Clermont, consolidating the rule and issuing the orders to crusade, to retake the Holy Lands from the non-believers. Thousands of men, depraved and deprived of knowledge, were convinced to partake in the satanic expedition, as they were promised full exemption from civil jurisdiction and remission of sins. And so they embarked, thousands of them, mercilessly looting and ravishing all in sight, fearing nothing, for all was forgiven. Although they slayed in Christ's name, as they came closer to victory, the one they served as Lord became ever clearer. After the Norman chivalry conquered Jerusalem, envoys were sent to Venice to report the good news. Venice, in turn, immediately sent their own fleets against the weakened Islamic army to capture the ports of Jaffa and Haifa, vital to her own commercial interests. As they prepared to conquer the cities of Tyre and Ascalon decades later, the Crusaders unhesitatingly gave their offerings to their god. A third of each city was allotted to the oligarchy. And it was ensured that within all the kingdoms of the Crusades, a bakery, a bath, a market, and a free quarter were given to the Venetians. They would be exempt from all taxation, while the Christian king of Jerusalem would pay them a tax of 300 bezants annually. The chivalry, with permission by the papacy, went as far as to proclaim that wherever a Venetian went, their laws should follow them, for no law was higher than Venetian law. The only problem the oligarchy encountered in sponsoring these religious wars was that her strategic privileges within Constantinople were threatened. Alexius I of the Byzantine Empire was against the expedition of the Crusaders because they threatened Byzantium's own territories, so he demanded that Venice withdraw. For the rest of the 12th century, measures were taken against Venice by Constantinople, such as the order sent forth by the emperor on March 7, 1171, to arrest and imprison every Venetian within Byzantium's domain. This demonstrated to the oligarchy that her mother was no longer going to play her game, which was troublesome, for without access to the Black Sea, it would be difficult for Venice to secure maritime dominance. All the treasure that lay in the lands of India and China were necessary for Venice to complete her puzzle of extended monetarist practice worldwide. But these crafty devils had no need to fear. A plot lay ready for them to seize as soon as the opportunity arose. At the turn of the 12th century, Saracens waged war to retake the Holy Land from the Norman chivalry. The barons of France and Flanders immediately sent 6 messengers to plead to their birth mother, knowing that only with Venice could they defend themselves. They assembled at St. Mark's, where the ambassadors pleaded to the oligarchy.
Sirs, the most exalted and puissant of the barons of France have sent us to you, and they beg your favor, that you may be seized with pity for Jerusalem, which is in bondage to the unbelievers, and that for God's sake you will consent to aid them to avenge the shame of Jesus Christ. And they have chosen you, because they know that no people on the sea has so great power as you. And they bade us to fall at your feet, and not to rise until you grant that you will have pity on the Holy Land beyond the sea.
All six kneeled to the assembly in tears, until Doge Enrico Dandolo delivered the official Venetian reply. Venice assisted the expedition under the condition that they accept a debt of 85,000 marks, the equivalent of 20,000 kilograms of silver. Neither the King of England nor of France generated such an amount annually. As a matter of fact, it would take them nearly 2 years to reach such a sum, and that only if they didn't spend an ounce on anything. Yet, the oligarchy contracted that the debt should be paid within a year. The fools signed Satan's contract, and the result was as Venice expected. The chivalry failed to meet the demands of the contract. The rulers of finance proceeded to utilize their new debt slaves to fulfill the task the empire desired: unchallenged maritime control of the East. Ostensibly, the Venetians only required them to retake their ports in Dalmatia from the Christian kingdom of Hungary. But within a matter of months, Venice's real plot came into effect. By the spring of 1202, 40,000 crusaders, 440 large ships, with 50 galleys were on a direct course towards Constantinople. Upon arrival, as the city walls and gates were broken open, the dogs of war were unleashed, destroying everything, looting from the altars of churches, melting the great statue of Hercules for its bronze, and raping every woman in sight, nuns included. Dandolo and the Venetian fleets kept back, watching their dogs ravish the city. They wanted one thing: the islands and the coasts necessary for their maritime empire, and none amongst the Normans hesitated to grant Venice her desires. Her greatest rival in the Mediterranean was annihilated, and her choices of emperor and patriarch, those who would protect Venetian interests, were appointed. This doge had served the oligarchy well, for Venetian voyages could now continue uninterrupted. With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Shortly after the raids in Constantinople, Venice dictated that all exchange of silver and gold bullion could only lawfully occur within her lagoon. Bullion ships sailed twice a year from the imperial center to keep this private market flowing. Through this method, Venice sucked Europe dry of its 500-year-old silver standard and enforced a gold standard upon them. The Venetian gold ducat, minted in 1284 of October 31st, became the lawful currency of international trade. Simultaneously, with the assistance of the Mongolian hordes, Venice forced China and India off their gold standard and forced upon them instead Europe's silver for the wealthy and paper for the poor. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice. During this same interval, the Venetian financial tyranny saw the rise to power of their junior partners in Florence, the family banking houses of the Acciaioli, the Peruzzi, and the House of Bardi, then the largest banking house on the planet. These, among others, were the banks that privatized the revenues of states by providing the usurious loans to most of the kingdoms in Europe and southern Italy. Although they wielded significant power, they were merely practicing the usury and financial speculation which the Venetian-dominated monetary system required. They were loan sharks swimming within a Venetian sea. The floating exchange rate between silver and gold bullion, controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, caused even the gold florion, minted by the Florentine bankers to devalue to worthlessness. Nevertheless, the Florentine parasites served their master well until they became disposable.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which was the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money, so he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away, because the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt, is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind, and then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more, and you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
While generating profits of 2/3 on all investments in Europe, the Peruzzi, the House of Bardi, and the others would lure in new debt slaves through the yearly champagne fairs in France, using luxury goods imported from Asia as bait. By the beginning of the 14th century, these Lombard bankers were able to insinuate themselves so far into the administrations of both King Edward II and Edward III of England that they ran the king's personal finances, privatized England's revenues, and then charged England for their services. As part of this business, they convinced foolish Edward III to claim France as part of his kingdom, enticing him to spark the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Peruzzi Bank, through the Franzese bankers, provided the financial services for King Philip IV of France. Thus, through keeping the population in a state of bestiality and manipulating stupid people into wars, the Venetians kept their financial empire on top of the world. But with this practice of monetarism, significant productivity was abandoned, and the body of the state was sucked to the bare bone. The production of wool in England, Flanders, and Spain collapsed. Because of depreciating farmland and equipment, food crises broke out, resulting in repeated famine within the 1310s, 20s, and 30s. The nature of the system caused farmers to go bankrupt, forcing them to hand over their lands to the bankers. For lack of funds and neglect, bridge construction halted, while those built the century before were left to rot. Sanitation was a joke. Monasteries ceased educating the young, and population levels dropped as the system drove further and further towards bankruptcy. The fleas had consumed all the blood of their host. The city of Florence went bankrupt in 1342, and the banking houses of the Acciaioli and the Buonaccorsi followed suit. The Kingdom of France went bankrupt in 1337, and Edward III's England followed suit in 1340. With the fall of these two kingdoms, and Venice playing currencies against each other, the Peruzzi fell bankrupt themselves in 1345, and within the same year, the top bank on the planet, the House of Bardi, finally collapsed. The entire monetary financial system of the 14th century had now entered its phase of complete disintegration. With no legitimate system found to replace the failed one, the conditions were set to pave the way for the great calamity that was about to fall upon Europe. It had already killed 10 million in China, and over the next 2 generations, the A combination of plague, social upheavals, and wars wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. The empire had brought about the death that its existence promised.